Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. How's everyone doing? All right? I'm glad that we've got such a great turnout considering it's the last session of the evening. We've had a fabulous morning, actually an entire day of creative discussions, might I add, innovative discussions as well. So welcome to our panel on Asian fragmentation. We've got quite a bit of issues to tackle on this one. First of all, who am I? I'm Prerna Suri. I'm a broadcast journalist. I've worked with Al Jazeera, the BBC, and currently I'm with Channel NewsAsia, which is headquartered in Singapore. We're going to treat this panel as a free-form conversation with a few questions peppered in as well. And there will be time in the end, I hope to open up to all of you as well so that you get an opportunity to question the panel as much as I hopefully will get to as well. Our panel itself is quite an interesting mix of expertise and experience, and hopefully we can bring the discussions back to our own individual experiences so that all of us get back quite a bit from it. So that's it for me when it comes to talking. I'm joined by Wempy Dyocta Koto. He's the CEO of Wardour and Oxford. Sam Rosenbalm, the gentleman on the extreme left of me, is director for Microsoft. And last but certainly not least is Ween. He's director at Juniper Network. So gentlemen, welcome as well. Asian fragmentation itself is quite a broad topic. So perhaps the best way to tackle it would be to talk about what each of you think when it comes down to its definition. So perhaps maybe if we can start with Sam and then work our way down here.
Thank you. As I think about Asian fragmentation, I think back to a couple weeks ago. We had our first ever Southeast Asia Imagine Cup finals, which is a competition that's been running for about 15 years across the globe, which brings university teams who are testing out technological ideas in a worldwide competition. For these 10 finalists, one of the teams from Bangladesh had never been on an airplane before. And that contrasts that with teams from Australia or other places that are used to doing that frequently. And it just really sets up the diversity and the different types of environments that teams will have or different countries will have. Nepal is also in there. One of the teams from Nepal was building a solution around how to track cattle and those dying in herds. So there's just this diversity, and I wouldn't necessarily call it fragmentation in a sense, but just being aware that there are big differences across Asia that we have to deal with from a startup perspective and just a local ecosystem to grow those. And for Microsoft, what we are trying to do is build those people-to-people connections that allow innovation to happen and the relationships to build that help people interact with each other. And it goes back to the I guess, Microsoft being in this for the long haul. Our mission is to empower individuals and organizations around the world to achieve more. We do that through three primary areas leading up to the startup ecosystem. It's working with youth in the schools and students. We talked about Imagine Cup, and over the last 5 years in Asia specifically, we've reached about 380,000 students across universities in a lot of the different countries in APAC. It also deals with Youth Spark because we believe that cognitive abilities and computational skills are going to be vital for students and as they graduate from schools and go into the workforce. So our programs like Youth Spark and Dream Spark have touched about 80 million of the 717 million youth in APAC, again, over the last 5 years. And for them, it's about tapping into that creativity of youth, leading to innovation, which empowers them then to kind of build the world that we'll be in the future. And finally, as they graduate from the student experience, they become startups. And we've supported through our BizSpark program about 24,000 startups across APAC. And even here in Singapore, we take that a step a higher level where we look at accelerators and working with NUS and others to hand out what we call BizSpark Plus, which is 120K in Azure credits to these startups, and we've done about $2 million worth of that in Singapore alone. Again, helping these startups in the early stage to focus on building their product and getting customers versus worrying about infrastructure. So through those connections in those different programs, USpark, DreamSpark, BizSpark, Imagine Cup, it it starts to kind of break through that fragmentation, introduce people to each other so they can then kind of build that business system that will help them be successful.
Great. Ewan?
So for me, if I look at Asian fragmentation, right, I think I look at it from a fundamental of people, right, and the geopolitical situation that happens and everything in between, right. So the Asian fragmentation will ever go away. People's culture, people's way of doing things, and the way they consume services, what they deliver, how they deliver services, and all that kind of things across APAC will always be diverse. That's what we live with, right? That's what I live with in dealing with the entire APAC in my day-to-day job, right? And you think about it from Japan all the way to Australia, they are so diverse. In the Japanese sense, right, they are very high contextual in their nature of doing things. They will have asked 1,000 questions to derive at a conclusion. Whereas you have the low context countries, typically like in India, where a simple yes, no, and then they go out and do their job. And they come and socialize with you to see whether it's wrong, right, and course correct, basically. So I think I look at the entire APAC, if I look at my definition of Asia fragmentation, right, it's always going to be there. The thing is that if you look at what Juniper is trying to do, since he talked about Microsoft, I'm going to talk about Juniper. So we power the internet. You talk about today, I think the entire discussion, other panelists were talking about IoT, 5G, and all kind of things. The underlying tonalities that we power those things to bring people together. And I think that in the digital world that we live in, the Asian fragmentation, right, is getting smaller. We are living in a smaller and smaller world because of the digitalized world that we live in. And the connection, even from now today, if I want to have a conversation 8,000 miles away in San Francisco with any of my colleagues, it's a simple, click of a button on my mobile phone. So I think from an Asian fragmentation perspective, it's getting smaller, but like anything else, right, when everything gets smaller, different type of fragmentation happens, and it grows. So that's my definition. I think it's always going to exist. We just need to adapt and learn it and embrace it, basically.
Wempy, I'm curious to know about your definition as well. Is that, because I think it was last year at InnovFest as well, when you were talking about how Asia is not homogeneous. We have different currencies, different politicians, different political systems, different economic systems. So how would you see when we talk about Asian fragmentation?
Absolutely, and I think it's important to just give a bit of definition to the terminology of Asia, firstly, from a geographer's as well as a marketer's standpoint. And it can be classified as a singular word or a singular market, but also within that particular singular area, it runs from east there through to west, from north down to south, to from Japan to Australia, etc. And so you get a completely heterogeneous market. There's nothing homogeneous about Asia at all, right? From a political standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, from a geographic standpoint, from a any sort of standpoint that you want, any sort of perspective or view, Asia is completely fragmented in that way. Now, when you combine Asia and fragmentation, there's a negative connotation to that, isn't there? It's fragmented, it's a problem, it's a challenge. But I believe that it would be a fruitful discussion to really journey towards how we can capitalize on that fragmentation, how all these differences that make us and compose us can be capitalized upon so we can actually advance the region together. So to me, it does have a negative connotation, but how do we evolve that into a positive discussion on evolving that fragmentation? Not celebrating all the differences and acknowledging all the differences, but certainly streamlining that.
I think it's a good point to pivot, as we've been talking about since this morning as well, to the point that you were making, Wempy, which is Asia also poses, and I use the word Asia again in quite broad terms here, to talk about the opportunities. So perhaps if you'd like to start off on that, what are the opportunities that you're looking at? Which are the key markets? As somebody who mentors startups and young companies, which markets should they be sort of looking at?
Well, there are differences. For example, let's look at it from a religious standpoint. Now, Asia, we have Philippines, which is like 90% Catholic, and then Thailand, which is about 85% Buddhist, and Indonesia, which is about 90% Islamic. Now, that's really fragmented with majority different religions. But you can look at it from an Indonesia or Malaysia standpoint, where the Sharia movement is so strong that from a fintech standpoint, now I'm advising roughly about 6 startups that are just strictly devoted to the Sharia market, because interest is haram or illegal in the Islamic religion. And so now new startups and new services are being created specifically for that Sharia market, where it's not about accruing an X percentage amount of interest on a monthly basis, but it's all about dividend sharing. So there's an opportunity there in fintech. And you know, fintech seems to be quite pervasive in its ability to defragment or even fragment further the particular market, because there's a startup movement that's trying to find the middle road, but then there's another market there that's starting to build the Sharia market also. So it's 2 different forces pulling it.
And yes, Sam, I mean, we were talking about this just before our discussion as well, that you actually look after APAC, which is quite different from, let's say, China, India, ASEAN put together as well. So what are some of those opportunities that you see in those markets, particularly perhaps Australia and New Zealand, which somehow the others are missing?
Yes. So Australia and New Zealand tend to be more export markets for the startup scene. Australia, although it's a very large area and country, the connections they have, and also New Zealand, back to other startup ecosystems. So if you think about the top 20 startup ecosystems around the world, you have Singapore and Australia are both in those top 20. And for New Zealand especially, you only have about 4.5 million people in the country. So if you're trying to build a user base of 5 million people, you're really looking at export. So you have to leverage those connections to the States or to Europe to try and get those markets and kind of be thinking of that mindset of how you're going to do it. Contrast that with some other areas, like if you're in Bangladesh or Indonesia or others, you may have, just as was just mentioned, some very specific solutions that are geared towards your market, whether it's a language issue or specific government regulations or from a religious standpoint. And then how do you potentially leverage that to go across country? In a commercial side, one of the ways that Microsoft helps facilitate that is as startups become more successful and turn into more established software companies, we have the ability to match them up, we call it speed dating, with some of our sales teams in different countries. And so we'll generally have a mix when we do these speed dating events of local software companies and startups that are doing innovative things, some regionals from across APAC, and then occasionally what we call globals, so companies that are based out of the US or Europe that have unique solutions in a vertical space that we then bring into these countries. But one of the things that we do is to make sure that we don't just bring in a company that's going to fly someone in on an airplane and then leave. There has to be that local presence. And the software companies, we make sure before we do that they're going to be there to support a solution after they leave. So they have to have either a local team or they need to have local partnerships with a channel partner or a systems integrator that can support that sale and make it happen after the fact.
So maybe here's a question for the entire panel. When you decide to conquer, let's say, an Asian market, is there a particular strategy that you go in with? Let's say, do you want a local partner, or would you be happy parachuting in and providing the product? Can you have a business maxim which fits all markets in Asia? Anyone can jump in.
Actually, I just want to add on to the point that Sam has made about the opportunity, if I don't mind, right? And I think I have a different, maybe a curveball in the not a solution, but basically my opinion on it, right? I think that we focus on the surface level. Asian fragmentation, like I said, right, my definition is that it's going to always be there. It's us to embrace and, adopt and make sure that you can circumvent that, and then the opportunities for startup is aplenty. Because today there are three things I'm going to put up, right? One, I feel that for startup, right, this is the time and this is the age where you can leverage technology to reduce, because your barrier entry is very small, it's very little. And therefore your opportunity to enter the market, even a brick and mortar market, right, it's very huge. An example, that's why we talk about digital disruption, right? They talk about, like, for example, the biggest transportation company today is Uber. They didn't start up with owning a fleet of taxis or trucks to become that big. They just start up and say, hey, look, we're going to create an app on a phone that will, call a taxi for you. And that's how the barrier entry is diminished, right? And you talk about hotels, Airbnb. They didn't have, billions and millions of dollars of assets in terms of hotels across the world to be that big today. And that's why I'm saying that from a startup perspective, the world is oyster. If you leverage the technology that you have. Moving forward, right, from a Juniper point of view, we think that this digital disruption age has passed. It's now going into a stage of digital cohesion, where we're looking at the previous panelists were talking about IoT, 5G. These are all creating a lot of ubiquitous access for all of devices. And because of that, the opportunity to reach out to the audience, the target audience you want, whatever audience it is, it's huge. It's not just saying that if I start an app today, it has to be Singapore confined. Maybe because of compliance. But you can move the apps into other regions, other countries, and adopt it very quickly if you have the reach. So to me, I look at the opportunity for startup today. It's plenty, right? The world is the oyster. You can imagine and think of a solution or service that you can offer that can be consumed in a country by people, right? That's my opinion in terms of the opportunity. And then if you ask the question in terms of the sorry, you're asking the question on...
Just if you had any key business maxims, any kind of common ethos that you could apply to all markets in Asia, or do you need to customize it?
Simplicity for me in my work, day-to-day work, if I look at a market and I need to enter into a market, there are typically four things that I look into, right? One is basically the two things that's simple, size and growth, right? You look at size of the market and growth of the market. The other two is less obvious. You look at competition as well. Is there competition that you're competing with? How easy is it to get around the competition or work against the competition, sell against the competition? And then the last one is reach. And reach could be internal and external. Right? Internal meaning that do you have sustainment power in maintaining yourself in the market for a long term and compete in that market, right, for long term. And then external reach could be the three things, right? You talk about organic growth. You hire people in the country, you grow that market. Or it could be acquisition that you want to do, which is really a high price that you pay. Or partnership. And partnership opens up the doorway to everything, right? A whole different model altogether. It could be joint venture, it could be a partnership, reseller model, distribution model, a master distribution model, and stuff like that. So that's simplicity of it in that sense.
And I tend to believe that local insight is the business maxim. And you can parachute as much as you like or work from an ivory tower as much as you like, but there's nobody who knows the Indonesian market better than an Indonesian, or the Vietnam market better than a Vietnamese, or a China market better than a Chinese living in that particular market. And so I would always recommend local knowledge and local insight to grow any particular startup. So that would be my take on that. But when we talk about fragmentation also, let's talk about technology fragmentation. And that's a huge thing, because not everybody carries a smartphone in Asia, right? You have, like, Nokia is still very powerful in India, right? You have different brands that are still growing very strong that wouldn't work in other particular markets. For example, you have particular brands that are still very strong in Japan that would never work in Southeast Asia. You have brands that, simply because, and what's driving this fragmentation, technology fragmentation, is the fragmentation of the social classes of Asia, right? And it's this middle class, it's this really weird middle class that's driving this fragmentation, because you have people coming above the poverty line right now, right, that are forming part of the middle class of Asia, that are barely starting to afford to think beyond their stomachs and now their child's education and clothing, etc. So they've just made it past the poverty line, but they still haven't reached the pinnacle of that middle class where they're able to have a bank account, right? And remember also that there are 2 billion people, there are billions of people that do not even have bank accounts. And 50% of those people live in Asia. So when we even think about that particular banking service, there's huge fragmentation. And that's driven by this middle class, which is really quaint in its, because, you get the affluence in America and Europe, and they're roughly on that same sort of level.
Yeah.
Right? Your friends in Amsterdam are pretty much on par with your friends in London and your friends in Paris. But somebody in Jakarta, right, could be living a completely absolutely different life to a person who's living only like a 45-minute drive away from their home in Jakarta. And that's how fragmented even a city is. So when we talk about jumping straight from Singapore to Indonesia or Singapore to, I always recommend local insight. And not just local insight, but actually down to community insight.
I think you're right. I mean, when it comes down to, let's say, China, India, ASEAN, we're talking about 3.5 billion consumers right there. So what Wempy was also talking about, localization over globalization, do you see that changing in the companies that you work for as well? Microsoft, of course, is a huge gargantuan giant of software. So when you enter markets, if you can divulge, what's your strategy?
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to the mission statement of Microsoft of trying to empower people, and it does take time. I think that, and it starts with the youth and educating them and helping them build those computational skill sets that will allow them to start breaking out of that poverty level. So we're seeing tremendous amount of coding capability coming out of Vietnam and Philippines, not necessarily traditional coding. You think of coding and outsourcing and those types of things, you might think of India. But Philippines is now becoming a great outsourcing place for telemarketing and kind of call center type activity. Vietnam, again, with developers that are kind of getting skill sets through the programs like USpark and DreamSpark, where we give them access to training, we give them access to the developer tools to learn and do these things. Even Sri Lanka is as kind of a very infant ecosystem from the startup space, but is growing and will tap into its neighbors of India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia as potential markets for them to export, right? They won't export to the US and Europe, but they will to their neighbors. And again, that takes time. It's the connections, it's putting them in with the programs that help them kind of grow and develop. It's Microsoft partnering with the local private and public partnerships. So ASEAN, for example, celebrated their 50th kind of anniversary in Manila, and that was the same reason we held our Imagine Cup Southeast Asia finals there, to kind of celebrate the partnership with ASEAN. And again, ASEAN's about empowering those countries and trying to break through the fragmentation and bring them together on some common areas for joint development of that Southeast Asian ecosystem. And then, again, I think that's the long-term strategy. It may not go as fast as we want in some cases. And then you have, we talked about religious things, but you also have political challenges at some times that can slow things, or economic. So when currency valuation hits Malaysia or Indonesia, and we have kind of challenges with the ecosystem being able to grow, but long term we think it will progress. And Malaysia, for example, because of the lower cost, is starting to become stronger from a development standpoint, because you can get low cost, efficient developers to kind of work on startups. And we really see that across our startup ecosystem, that startups will be savvy about where they go and get development resources, and they might have development houses in multiple countries, depending on what they're doing.
And for me, I mean, for the day-to-day job that I do, in terms of localization, I look at it from a tree perspective, and add on to what Sam and the other panelists has been saying, right? Localization, getting a local person there is fundamental for us because of the legal and compliance stuff that we need to work around as well. the political, social, economical stuff in the country itself. So if you are a startup, I think that is actually a good advice. Having a local ground person actually to understand that is actually fundamental. It is something that we work as a fundamental as well for us. The other thing that we look at as well is languages, right? If you don't understand language, you don't understand culture. You don't understand culture, it's difficult to engage in that country itself. So we look at language as well, localization of language. And the third part that I look at is from a marketing perspective, very much the engagement model. I think we need to localize our engagement model for the way that different countries, the way they will consume those services and the product that they want from us.
I was about to say, because we have a lot of startups and founders in the audience as well. So if there's one advice that you would give them when it comes down to conquering Asia and doing business in that, what would that be? Anyone?
Not sure, I didn't completely get the question.
Just one piece of advice that you would give to younger companies, to startups who'd like to, let's say, have their foray into Asia and set up businesses there.
I may jump into
Yeah,
that.
go ahead.
Go for it, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of advice that I can probably impart, but I would say really define your market very, very carefully. Because it's easy to say, I want a market of 25 to 35-year-olds, or male, female, etc. But you really, really got to zoom in. And it's actually not the, it's often not the parameters of like the quantitative parameters that you've got to really figure out, but it's all the qualitative and the psychographic, the psychography of your particular market. How do they think, right? Because I've spoken about religious fragmentation.
Yep.
I've spoken about technological fragmentation. And I've also spoken about cultural or social class fragmentation. But let me talk to you now also about population pyramid fragmentation also, because that's a huge thing too. Because what we've got here is that we've got nations with completely different population pyramids, right? We've got, I'll refer back to Indonesia again, which has a huge millennial population, right? And then you go a bit north, you go much more north, and there's a huge aging population in various countries. And the way that millennials consume anything and everything is completely different, right? They are influenced in terms of their decision-making processes, not really by their parents anymore, but by their ambassadors and influencers. Who do they look up to? Because their parents are probably busy on a daily basis, working, trying hard to make a living, right? But they're influenced by their, whether it's their celebrities who become their pseudo role models, right? Whoever are the top social media influencers in their particular sphere. So what governs a millennial's decision to purchase is going to be completely different from what governs, somebody who's in my sort of generation and even above. And that population fragmentation in itself presents itself as a challenge, but also as an opportunity. So you really need to zoom in exactly who is your target, how do they think, and what's going to convert them from an observer into a consumer.
Yeah, I would comment on maybe just 3 quick examples of some startups that are either in the Asia market or trying to break into the Asia market. The first one is a US-based company called Agile PQ. Now, you could say, I'm going to go after the IoT space, which is huge, and the market potential is in the billions, but they're focused very specifically on encryption for IoT endpoints. And I'm talking about the very small endpoints that don't have big processing power and don't have a lot of battery life, but are critical for securing it. So say an endpoint that's on a power grid with millions of endpoint units. So they partnered with an IoT manufacturer out of India, who then is working with Microsoft on some specific customer implementation. So kind of a very specific focus, looking at the end game of how do I get on the device and not just go get some customers, but kind of doing a 3-way partnership between the device manufacturer, Microsoft, and then the end customer. The other one is a local Singapore company, Dathenia.io. This was actually an example of a non-traditional startup ISV. It came out of a bank where they had trouble classifying documentation and securing that documentation for regulations. The IT director actually built up the own solution. The bank said, we don't want to be a software company, so they spun them out as a startup. And they recently just competed against 100 other startups in Singapore to go on a Singapore delegation to TaiCon in Santa Clara this coming weekend. But again, that's an example of focusing on something very specific in the banking community for classifying documentation. The third one is more it's an Australian startup called Drawboard. They do PDF markups. Now again, you could go out and say, we're going to tackle the entire PDF markup community or ecosystem, but they're focused very much on engineering and construction. And they focus on two very specific technologies, ink, digital ink, and pen technology working on Microsoft Surface devices. So very specific target market, very specific technologies, but because of that, they've been able to leverage kind of the Microsoft marketing engine and sales engine to go into those accounts. So the advice I would give startups is, and it goes back to this, what customer segment are you going after? Or what vertical are you going after? Try to be specific. Try to get those early wins, proof of concept, whatever it is that gets some customer traction and validation, because the investors are going to look at that a lot more than a PowerPoint deck that shows a huge potential of $1 billion in a worldwide market.
And that,
Yeah.
sorry. So for me, if I have one advice to give to you, startup, right, then I would say that, like I said before previously, right, the oyster is yours today in the world, and I believe that still. And if I have some time to explain, I can spend half an hour talking about why digital enables you to do what you need to do in an innovative way, right, to reduce all the barriers that you have in APAC or in Asia, right. But I would say that with all this fragmentation, all this discussion about fragmentation and all that, the one thing I will tell you is don't worry too much about those fragmentation. Those fragmentation will always exist, right? And I always say that there's technology out there in the cloud today that will help you to analyze the markets that you want to go to, the target audience you want to go to, the segmentation you want to go to, the kind of customer you go to, and actually use technology to help you to reach out to these customers itself. And why I say that, right? I said it because I'm a true believer in technology, and I believe that the cloud is going to change all things that we have today. We're talking about digital cohesion, and I said again, you think about it today, if you take out your Google phone, right? Google Now, I don't know how many of you use it, but it actually tells you, right, if it's 6 p.m., you always go home at 6 p.m., it tells you, Mr. So-and-so, at 6 p.m., the traffic is bad, you're going to take 27 minutes to reach home. Google Now. Those are all analytics that's being done, that's collected up into the cloud itself. Same thing for marketing, right? Where we do it, we are very focused in terms of how we reach our customers. So as a startup, you know your audience, you know your product or your services you want to offer. There are analytics out there in the cloud itself that can help you to reach to those customers itself. They are already available. It's just how to reach out to them. So to me, one advice is don't worry too much about fragmentation itself. There are ways around it to leverage technology to actually assess your customer that you want through the different multitudes of mechanisms that you have, right?
It's a good counterbalance of optimism, because so far our discussions have been slightly negative about fragmentation as well. All throughout this morning and the afternoon, we've also been talking about innovation and whether we can claim that Asia is innovative or not, considering there's heavy regulations here, perhaps interference from governments, and also a very turmoil-filled economic climate at the moment, with China slowing down and the developments that we're seeing in the United States as well. So, pretty simple question. Do you think Asia is innovative enough?
Maybe I start first. And well, this is an opinion that I have as well. I think that in Asia itself, you look at the innovation, right? If there's a proper platform, proper environment, and there's a proper resources to resource for this innovation idea to come to fruition, I'm very sure that Asia itself will overtake Europe and America in terms of the innovation that we produced out there. That's for
Wempy,
sure.
I can see you nodding your head.
Well, I'd love to agree with you on that one.
Oh, you disagree?
I would love to agree, but I would honestly disagree with you. I think what's happening right now with innovation in Asia is that there's a lot of success transfer happening, right? I'm not going to deny that. There's a lot of innovation coming, obviously, out of Silicon Valley, out of Europe, And what Asia is doing is piggybacking really right now. I don't really see tremendous innovation coming out of Asia. I see some startups there that are, even when you look at some of the unicorns that are coming out of Asia right now, Sunicorns, which are soon to be unicorns, or unicorns, which are already unicorns, none of them are really Asian ideas. There are ideas that have succeeded in North America or Europe, but none of them were uniquely developed in Asia to solve an Asian problem. So if an objective question was asked, is Asia innovative? I would say it's still at importation/imitation phase. That's where I would say. Innovation is owned by Silicon Valley, is owned by Switzerland, Look, but hang on, also, I'm going to give a bit of credit to Asia, is that Asia, when it comes to technology and innovation, there's fragmentation there also, right? You have an island like Singapore, which is extremely innovative, right? But then after that, you go into other parts of Asia, which is just all about, let's slap up what the next technology is that's going to come through. So there are obviously very gaps. But what you'll see, and it's very scary to me, this is really scary to me. Why is it that the most innovative countries in the world do not have any resources, natural resources, or lack natural resources? Right? Let's look at it right now. Switzerland has very few natural resources. Compare Switzerland to Indonesia, which has, fisheries, which has mining, which has forestry, which has oil, all these different billions of natural resources, right? Let's just compare them to like Indonesia. Switzerland has nothing compared to Indonesia. But why does Switzerland rank as one of the world's, in the Economic Complexity Index, as one of the world's most innovative nations? Then you leap over to Israel, and Israel also ranks as one of the world's most innovative nations too. With such lack of resources and lack of any sort of natural resources, Israel is very high on innovation. And then you come down to Singapore, which also doesn't have much resources, which is an island, doesn't have any sort of like natural resources such as, like mining and all that stuff in Indonesia, right? But is extremely innovative, extremely. Ranks about number 8 in the Economic Complexity Index. And this goes back to the point that the greatest resource in this world is not mining or fisheries or, natural, is human resources, are human resources. And that's what the Singapore government has done very well in terms of grooming its human resources, that a lot of Asian markets have not, and this is why Asia is so fragmented in that way.
Well, we've reached the end,
Oh,
unfortunately, just when we were getting the discussion kick-started as well, and there we will have to leave it. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for staying with us for so long. Please help me thank the panelists as well. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much to Prerna and her panel there. Very insightful.